The U.S. budget deficit is soaring under President Trump. According to the Treasury Department, the federal budget deficit increased by $113 billion in fiscal year 2018, Trump's first full year as president, first fiscal year as president. That's a 17% increase from 2017, and it's the highest the deficit has been in 6 years. The deficit now stands at $779 billion, and the deficit, of course, is the difference between what the government takes in and what it spends. Today, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell tried to claim that this steep increase is due to the social safety net.
It's very disturbing, and it's driven by the three big entitlement programs that are very popular: Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid.
But the data points elsewhere. One of the biggest contributing factors to this deficit spike, the GOP tax cuts. According to Treasury data, tax revenues from corporate returns dropped 31% in the fiscal year 2018 compared to the same period last year, which would be strange because companies are making more money than they have made before. Congress knocked off more than $1 trillion worth of forecasted tax revenue and boosted government spending at the same time. It stands in stark contrast to the promises from Trump officials and from congressional Republicans before the tax cuts passed.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
I'm confident this is not only revenue neutral to the government, but actually is very likely to be a revenue producer.
We're right there in the sweet spot with economic growth that gives us more revenue. We're where we need to be.
The problem may get worse. As Bloomberg notes, the Congressional Budget Office forecasts that government spending will outweigh revenue by $973 billion in the fiscal year 2019 and more than $1 trillion the following year. That would be the first time the deficit exceeds $1 trillion since 2012, when the economy was still recovering from the Great Recession. Joining us now are Austan Goolsbee, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. He's currently a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. Bruce Bartlett also joins me, an economist and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under President George H.W. Bush, and he's the author of the book, The Truth Matters. Bruce, you and I sat here at this table that I'm at and discussed the fact that these Republican tax cuts are not going to result in the growth that the president kept claiming they would to make up for this deficit. Any thinking person with some economics background could have looked at these tax cuts and said, you're going to get yourself into a bigger deficit. We are where we expected to be. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think it's important to understand that every single Republican who commented on this issue a year ago and said revenues would rise or that they would not fall, I'm talking about Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, Steve Mnuchin, they were all lying. They're liars. They knew that they were lying when they said those things. And they wanted revenues to fall because they wanted the deficit to rise. Because
why is that? Why would a Republican want the deficit to rise?
Because what they really want to do is cut entitlement programs. They want to cut those programs that Mitch McConnell talked about, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And they understand they're very politically popular. They can only be cut when there is a deficit so large that people are frightened and they feel we have no choice. And that has been their goal for 40 years.
Austan Goolsbee, Greenberg research poll indicates a 12-point gap in support for GOP tax cuts. 52% strongly or somewhat oppose the tax cuts, while 40% strongly or somewhat support it. And in a Gallup poll from last week, it shows that 2/3 of people polled have not seen an increase in take-home pay from the GOP tax cuts. Here's the thing. I've sat here and spoken to Kevin Hassett at the White House, who said that the average American is going to see a $4,000 increase from these tax cuts. I could never get that math to work. I don't think you could either.
That's not math. Of course the math didn't work, because it's not math. Hashtag, where's my $4,000?
Right.
Look, of course wages didn't go up $4,000. Of course the tax plan is unpopular, because people are looking at it. What happened? They cut taxes by $2 trillion for high-income people and large corporations. And lo and behold, we lost $2 trillion. And now to act as though, who could have ever thought by cutting these taxes that the deficit would grow? We have to go cut Social Security. I'm telling you, if they attempt to cut Social Security, they're going to be run out of town in a landslide.
In 2011, when President Obama was attacking spending, this is what Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell had to say about it then. Bruce, listen to this.
He doubles the debt after his term in office and triples it by the end of his budget. He sends our debt on an upward trajectory that is completely unsustainable.
What's reckless, Bob, is the $1.6 trillion deficit we're running this year.
Now, Bruce, the reason I bring this up is because we have all argued, maybe you've never been on the side of the argument that said that sometimes deficits are a good thing, but we've seen deficits sort of following every war that we've been in America and some recessions where the government has introduced stimulus spending. We last saw it after the most recent, the Great Recession. So it's not, some people don't have a universal view about debts and deficits, that sometimes they're useful and sometimes they're not. But it does seem that consistently, as you've said, over the last 40 years, Republicans are consistently against running deficits when they are not in control of the levers, and when they are in control of the levers, they seem to have far fewer problems with it.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, remember back to the end of the Clinton administration when we had budget surpluses.
Yeah.
And we had surpluses because of legislation that raised taxes that every Republican voted against. And then when the surplus emerged, they tried to take credit for it. And George W. Bush inherited those surpluses, and the very first thing he did was have a big tax cut, and then another big tax cut, and then another big tax cut. If we had just kept taxes and spending on automatic pilot from January 2001, by the end of the Bush administration, we would have paid off the national debt. So basically, Republicans, they just make up these lies about the deficit. They love the deficit. That is the truth of the matter, because that is what gives them the political wherewithal to cut spending, which is what they really care about, and only spending that helps people. They want to increase spending for the military. So the truth is they love deficits.
Austin, what happens next? Because Bruce is right. We're getting to a point where conservative orthodoxy says if you're running up deficits, you're going to have to cut. We know that there are great difficulties in cutting what we call entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. We know we're not seeing any cuts to the military, so we'll start to see programs cut that are easy to cut first. But Mitch McConnell has already sounded the drums about cutting into entitlement programs. If Americans don't support this tax plan as it is, are they going to get on board with that?
No, of course they're not going to get on board with it. Look, I tell you what's going to happen. Two things are going to happen. One has already started. The Republican Party has not learned anything from this episode of tax cutting, blowing up the deficit. They've already proposed what they're calling Tax Reform 2.0, which is another multi-trillion-dollar tax cut for high-income people and big corporations. And then the second thing that you're going to see start to happen is they're going to try to cut entitlements, and then when it becomes so obvious that how unpopular that is with the American people, they're going to try to blame that on Democrats. So you've seen them in the midterm elections here about health care and Obamacare. The Republicans trying to claim that they're the ones trying to protect the ban on using pre-existing conditions, and that they're trying to extend health care to all Americans when they have actually been trying to repeal Obamacare and get rid of those.
Guys, thanks for helping me analyze this. Austin Goolsbee and Bruce Bartlett.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.